Welcome to another live weather and climate office hour. Today we are really going to talk about the weather, primarily, maybe some short-term climate thrown in there as well. Just a reminder that this channel is sponsored by Reask, a climate tech company that is helping rethink extreme weather risk in a warming world. And hopefully, as opposed to last time, when there were some audio volume input control issues, hopefully the audio, not only is the audio quality high, but hopefully the audio volume is adequate for people on all types of devices today. I won't spend too much time on that unless people tell me that it's terrible, but fingers crossed that problem is solved. I've locked in the gain on the microphone, so hopefully that will help. So today I wanted to talk about the solstice weather today into the weekend. It is a bit of an unusual solstice weather-wise in California for a couple of reasons. It's going to be much cooler but also much windier with pretty high fire risk in some spots. I'll talk about that as one of the key focuses of today. Also, I want to talk about how drought and wildfire has been evolving the last few weeks, the bigger picture around the western U.S., and then also take another look at the summer outlook and how it might be different from what has happened to date, and how so the maps of temperature anomalies in the spring may end up looking very different than the ones that we most likely expect to unfold later in the season. It sounds like folks are saying the audio is good, so it's always nice to solve problems on a Friday afternoon. Okay, so I'm actually going to jump right into some screen sharing since I do have a lot of visual information to share. This will be another minor test to make sure the audio stays good because the audio has been switching between the toggle switches. Let us see. So now you're going to see my window. You should also see me in the lower right corner. I'm now making that a permanent fixture of these sessions to make sure that I don't run into any more copyright issues on YouTube when I'm restreaming live news media reports, for example. But if the audio stays good, we're in good shape. So I wanted to start, and I'll share this graphic in just a moment here, with the map of, as I toggle over to that, of the recent temperature anomalies in California first of all, I'm going to start with the month of May. And that's not the month of May. This is the month of May. By the way, this is a product from the West-wide Drought Tracker, which is provided as a service of the Western Regional Climate Center, which was defunded earlier this spring, emergently refunded temporarily, but is very much still at risk of going away with the new congressional budget. The appropriations bill that is coming out right now would potentially defund the NOAA regional climate centers once again. So currently operational, but if it were to become unoperational again later this year, we would lose products like this one, which are very useful when we share it on screen. So this is what I wanted to talk about first because it sort of gives a sense of where we're coming from. Let me bring up my nifty handy screen drawing tool. There it is. So let me choose a good color here. Bright, let's choose pink today. That seems to be the color of the day. Contrasts with the ones on the map. So what we've got is, again, this is a percentile map, so you don't look for units of temperature, but this is a rank, essentially saying among the distribution of all years from 1895 through the present, where did May 2025 fall in the, I guess that's now 150 years, almost 150 years, so that's 130 years. So over a century of record keeping, where did this May fall in the overall average temperature rank? And the answer, well, it depends on where you were. If you were on the Del Norte or Mendocino coast, for example, it was notably cool. You were in the bottom third, meaning you were in the coolest third of all such May months of May on record since the 1890s. So it was pretty chilly, and people have reflected as much. Same is true with coastal San Mateo, parts of the western Marin County, also falling into the bottom third, and in a couple of isolated cases, maybe even the coolest 10% of all years. Notably, nowhere was record coldest. That's not surprising. It would actually be very surprising if that was the case. There's a couple of pixels that kind of show up that way in Western Marin, but I think that's more noise than anything else. But the other story is if you draw a line right around here, and it goes to the Central Bay Area, and it comes pretty close to the coast in some spots. Sorry, I got to go around my camera on screen here. But pretty much this entire region, and then all of Nevada, anywhere within this pink hatched zone did in fact see significantly above average temperatures in May, either in the warmest third of all years on record or in fairly substantial splotches where there's darker orange in the top 10% of Mays on record. So that is to say, your mileage varies. There's a dipole. What do I mean by dipole? I mean that in this region, it was well above average, and then right along the coast, it was below average. So we have below and above. A dipole are, so think negative and positive. That's where the dipole is coming from. And my mouse just ran out of batteries, so excuse me while I plug that in. Oh, nope, there it is. All right, well, I have it close in case it runs out now. So temperature dipole, cool coast, warm inland. Now, one thing I want to emphasize is that the usual pattern this time of year is indeed much warmer across the inland valleys than it is along the coast. We have some of the coldest ocean at this latitude anywhere in the world right off the coast of San Francisco here. So we have that California cold current, all that upwelling out by the Farallon Islands. It tends to keep the coast pretty darn cool in May and June much of the time. So that's not surprising in itself. But what is a rank? What is an anomaly? Well, that means a departure from what you would usually expect in a given place at a given time of year. So this is not telling us that, of course, Sacramento is warmer than Ocean Beach in May. That's more or less expected, except under very unusual conditions. What this is telling us is that amplified pre-existing dipole, where the coast is typically chilly in spring and the inland valleys are typically warm, was even more amplified than usual. So not only was the Central Valley warmer than average, which it was, but the coast was also cooler than average, which accentuates the existing gradient between warm inland and cool coast. So what this means in practice is that, I'm drawing an area that encompasses, this area, and then let's call it, essentially this region here. That's the majority of the region that encompasses most of California's population. Of course, there's people who live elsewhere, and there's big cities elsewhere, but that is tens of millions of people collectively in those zones. And especially in coastal Northern California, they experience near or below average temperatures in May. And that's a little bit less true in coastal Southern California, but it was not a particularly warm May in coastal Southern California. But if you were in the Southern Sierra, for example, it was an exceptionally warm spring. In fact, in a lot of places, it was in the top 10% of all years. And remember, this includes all of the recent record-breaking years. So to be in the top 10% is saying something. On the east side of the Coast Ranges, it was really warm. The Northern Sierra, it was really warm. All of the Great Basin, it was really warm. Not record warm, to be clear, but it was much warmer than average. And so we're left in this position where a couple things are going on. One is that the experience of most of the population of California in these regions was very different than the experience of the majority of the land area of California in May. We've seen that fairly frequently in recent years. And what this means is that a lot of the places that are wildfire prone, for example, actually did experience a really warm and dry April and May period. This is where most of California's wildfires occur, and it was really warm. So your experience in the coastal part of the Bay Area, for example, or up in Mendocino County or Del Norte or further north, that does not really apply to a lot of the places that, for example, are under red flag warnings this weekend. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. There is another way to look at this, which is with the more recent temperatures. And again, this is the same kind of map from a different source. This is from the Climate Toolbox at climatetoolbox.org, and it's for a more recent period. So the Western Regional Climate Center only does full calendar months. Obviously, we're in the middle of June right now. So this is looking more recently at the last 30 days, including mostly June. What we see is that this pattern is actually even more accentuated, although on average, it's been warmer. So now, if we look at the last 30 days, we actually see that there are a lot of parts of the interior of California that have been near or record warm over the past 30 days. So any area in bright red is it experienced its warmest mid-May through mid-June period on record, at least relative to 1979 and 2020. So because that's not a full century or so, I think it's most fair to say anywhere in bright red was either record or near record warm during this period. And that's a big region. That includes most of the coast ranges. That includes essentially the entire Sierra Nevada, especially the southern Sierra, the foothills on all sides of the San Joaquin Valley, for example. It includes most of the inland deserts of Southern California. So again, it's not saying that, Palm Springs and Barstow were hotter than LA. It's saying that Barstow and Palm Springs either experienced their hottest mid-May through mid-June period on record or nearly so. So that is saying quite a lot. These places are hot to begin with, and yet this was still one of the hottest periods on record. And that's also true across essentially the entire Great Basin, which experienced all of it is either bright orange or, again, that top color. The 100th percentile literally means the warmest on record singularly. And so that's a big region. Again, there's been a narrow strip along the California coast, in this case mostly from Monterey Bay Area northward, that has been cooler than average. And again, this artifact in Western Marin shows up. I honestly don't really know if that's real or not. There aren't a lot of observing sites out there. But the point is, there was definitely a section of the northern and maybe central California coast, depending on how you describe it, that was still cooler than average over the past month. So this dipole is now even stronger between cool conditions here and literally record-breaking warmth between these two regions like this. So this pattern has persisted, and it actually looks like it's going to persist through at least the end of June, as I'll show in a moment. But this is a lot of unusual warmth. So don't let anybody tell you that California has been cooler than average this spring or even in the last month. That's true in some limited parts of immediate coastal California, but literally everywhere else, that's not the case. So let me just go back to the comments quick. I might actually take some of those comments on the screen quickly about the recent conditions before I move on to the next thing. Hello to everybody. Glad the audio is working well today. Glad I don't have to troubleshoot that one this time around. Okay, let's see. So the next thing I wanted to show, well, is let's take a look at the fires first. So here's a current satellite view over the southwestern U.S. I guess it's southwest, western and central U.S. But mainly what I want to show is that you can kind of see some stratus up over the Great Basin in far northern California. That's a little bit unusual for the time of year. I'll talk about why that's occurring for a moment. You see some afternoon thunderstorms over New Mexico, and that's not unusual for June. But otherwise, it's pretty clear across most of California and the desert southwest. You can see a nice little marine layer eddy down here in Southern California. Again, that's quite common in the low levels this time of year. Not a lot of fog central coast, though, and that's probably because we have some strong, dry winds that are trying to blow down from the north right now. But there's a couple of things I want to zoom in on. Well, actually, let's go over to the shortwave satellite. This is more of a thermal detection. And there's a few things of note. One is there are some notable wildfires currently burning. See these black dots in southwestern Utah? There's another one just south of the California border in Baja California. There's another major fire in southwestern New Mexico, and I believe another one here. I think that's in Chihuahua in Mexico. And so and also major fire up in Wyoming. And now, more recently, I believe as of this morning, a major fire just east of the California border and just south and east of Reno. So there are fires that are starting to pick up. Some of these are just skirting the California border, but smoke from multiple fires like this may actually end up in California. Generally, the smoke from these ones is sort of moving in this direction. But I just want to illustrate that wildfire season is starting to pick up, and we're getting to the point where continental scale satellite views, we can see the thermal signature from space on some of these. Later in the day, we might see more smoke activity coming from these fires. You can already kind of see a plume developing if you squint a little bit here and here. And so there are fires popping up. None of them look extremely threatening at the moment, but that could change, because there is a red flag warning in effect for almost this entire region right now, and I'll show you that in a moment. Well, actually, I'll show you that now. Here is where we are today with the red flag warning from the NOAA Storm Prediction Center. This is actually one of the specialty centers in Norman, Oklahoma. They do severe thunderstorms and fire weather. And so today, there is some elevated fire weather across the interior deserts, mountains of Southern California mainly, but also from along and east of the Sierra Crest, so the far eastern strip of California, seeing some fires. Again, that fire in Nevada is right around here, so right near the more elevated region. But look, if you go across the Great Basin into the Central Rockies, this blob region, much more elevated fire weather, drier and windier, and having the legacy of more extreme recent heat. Again, there's quite a few fires burning in this region. Unfortunately, they could really take off the next few days in Utah. But this is what we're looking like today. We go into tomorrow, and we actually see an expansion, well, a shift and an expansion, respectively. The Central Valley, all the way from the northern Sacramento Valley to the southern San Joaquin, and including also in this sort of zone, maybe surrounding it, the foothills as well. Elevated fire weather for grass fires in the valley itself and in the foothills surrounding it. Not super extreme, but definitely elevated, and we see that this higher risk area shifts eastward, but still includes a lot of Utah over here as we head into the weekend. And then Sunday, we actually have another, that is Saturday. Or is it? I guess these are just two different update cycles here. I see. Yes. Okay. So this is Saturday. This is the most recent Saturday prediction. By Sunday, the fire weather threat mostly moves east of California, but again, we still see it across the Central Rockies. So a couple of days of elevated fire weather today, more in the Sierra Nevada, and then tomorrow more in the Central Valley. And we are seeing some fires pop up. Actually today, here's a fire, looks like it's called the Camino fire, that's burning right now, just on the lower foothills. Looks like it's just downhill from Don Pedro Reservoir. This is the Watch Duty app. Again, I'm not super concerned about these kinds of fires right now necessarily, because the wildfire conditions are only moderately extreme. But if we look at the camera view, the live camera view, this is the last 15 minutes of it, you can see that this fire is burning particularly in grass and oak woodlands. So these aren't super dense fuels, and already you see this calming down. You can actually see an airdrop from a slurry from an air tanker in the most recent frame. We're going to see fires like this continuing to pop up over the next 24 to 48 hours, and as always, it can be a problem if it's in close proximity to a neighborhood. But this is not major Bay Area or Southern California urban interface kind of fire episode, nor is it a high Sierra forest fire kind of episode in most contexts. There is some risk on the eastern slopes, but not so much at the higher elevations or on the western slope during this event. There will probably be, as I said, there have been some other fires. By the way, it looks like there are a couple others. There's the Serendipity fire that just got going up, looks like southwest of Camptonville, so south of Bullard's Bar Reservoir, or northwest of Nevada City. This is a fire in timber understory, so it's not up in the crown, by the way. So it's burning through in the way that you might do a prescribed burn in the understory of a place like this. But of course, this is not a controlled burn, so it's cooking a little bit. Clearly, conditions are favorable for fire of some intensity. It does appear to be spreading, and so again, we're going to see fire. We are now squarely in fire season. But the good news is there's a lot of resources available right now. We don't have the kind of resource depletion that we sometimes see later in the seasons. There's lots of CAL FIRE folks who can hop into this. I don't know if this is state responsibility or federal land, but anyway. And who knows whether it's federal land any given week these days. That seems to be a moving target as well. But that's a subject for another conversation. But the fire up in Nevada, I guess that's the Connor fire. I hadn't taken a close look at these. That's a good 2,000 acre fire, so clearly this one has taken off more than some of the other ones. There are some very localized evacuations. It looks like I don't think there's a huge number of people who live to the east there's no major towns to the east of this, which is where I think it's heading primarily, although it might actually start to head more. Let me see if that's actually correct. I don't know if it's heading east, because the winds this weekend might be pushing it more north to south. So it could actually follow the 395 corridor, potentially. So I actually don't know what the winds are like, so disregard my specific view. But if I bring up the camera view for this one, well, I was going to say it looks like it's calming down, but then actually it looks like it just moved out of the camera view, since it looks calmer in this portion. But if you look at the left, which would be, in this case, I guess based on where the camera is looking, so this would be the north side of the fire. That's actually very active, spreading very quickly. So I wonder if there's, let's see, another camera in the area. Okay, so this is actually probably a better view. This camera is looking southeast, so if it's in the left of the frame, so it actually does look like the fire has started to really cook off again over the last 15 minutes or so. So that's a pretty active, and you can kind of see how far it's moved across the landscape, because the fire started. It looks like the heel of the fire is all the way over here, and it's already moved there. So clearly, actually, I am mistaken. This is closer to the 395 corridor than I thought it was. So there are some towns, obviously, in the foreground here. So this one could cause some problems later with the winds. It is in the red flag warning zone, as you can see on the watch duty map. So that's one to watch. And again, the eastern slopes of the Sierra are where we could see some challenges. And there is actually a red flag warning for Mammoth Lakes, the 395 corridor up past Mono Lake. Yeah, the whole 395 corridor, all the way from just north of Bishop to just south of Tahoe, actually, including Reno, Carson City vicinity. Okay, so that's enough watch duty for now. I did want to take a look at some of the current vegetation dryness levels. So again, this is the energy release component. It's not the perfect indicator of fire risk, but it does tell you something about the aggregate landscape-wide vegetation flammability levels. It doesn't necessarily tell you whether the grasses have cured locally or not, although they have at lower elevations and in the Great Basin primarily. So that's relevant here. Here's the Eastern Sierra. So the higher the value here, the drier and more flammable the vegetation is. Average levels are this thin line here. The current levels are this squiggly blue curve here with the prediction for the next few days in green at the end. So in the Eastern Sierra, where we're seeing this fire activity now, we are above average. We're nowhere near record-breaking levels for the time of year, but it is drier and more flammable than it would usually be. Excuse me. So that's the context for the Eastern Sierra Zone. Central Sierra, we have been right touching that record dry territory for the time of year. Now, for the time of year is doing a lot of work here because currently we are at typical flammability levels for late July. So we are running, say, 6-7 weeks ahead of schedule. So the current flammability level in the Central Sierra would not be unusual for July 25th or 30th over here, but it is unusual for June 20th, meaning we are running 1 to 1.5 months ahead of schedule in terms of that vegetation dryness, and that does put us in near record territory for flammability at this time of year in the Central Sierra. Some important context. Similarly, Southern Sierra, same story. We recently touched the record flammability level for the time of year. Again, not so unusual here for August, but this is actually even more anomalous in the Southern Sierra. Look how far out into the calendar year do we have to go for this thin curve to get where we currently are. We're talking, it usually crosses that line right around mid-August. So we are actually 2 full months ahead of schedule in terms of vegetation flammability in the Southern Sierra. I've been talking about how the early snowmelt has helped facilitate it. That was a prediction. Well, now we're seeing it. Again, vegetation not as flammable as it would be even during a typical August, but it is now near record flammability levels for mid-June, which is the context of today. Now the question is, will this curve continue to follow near record levels as we head into August? That's a big question mark. We'll see what happens with that. We do continue the tour. We're in the Sierra foothills where, again, not record-breaking currently. In fact, we're actually a little closer to average now, but recently we've been drier than average, but not extremely so in terms of the vegetation. The Central Valley, which does include some of the lower foothills, again, flammability well above average, although below record levels for the time of year. Central Coast Interior briefly touched some near record levels, although now is closer to average again as those onshore breezes have returned. Central Coast, again, near average. South Coast was recently above average, but now closer to average, so again, that's not a very notable one. There was a period of much anomalous dryness over the past few weeks, but that's predicted to return closer to average with this incoming cool trough. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And there are other mountains in Southern California. The deserts of Southern California are actually quite flammable. In fact, these are now above even peak seasonal flammability, which does occur roughly this time of year. Why is that? Even though it gets hotter later, it's because this is when the monsoon usually arrives and brings some moisture. So we'll see what happens, but right now we're close to record flammability levels in the deserts, and we don't normally talk about fires in the lower deserts so much because there's not a lot of vegetation to burn, but following wet years there is, and that is indeed the case. Not so much because this past winter was wet, but because the last couple of months, almost all the precipitation that occurred in the lower deserts of southeastern California occurred kind of late in the season. So, in fact, you can see that with some of these flammability dips when those precipitation events occurred this past spring. Upper deserts, notably at near record flammability levels for this time of year as well. So this is the situation in Southern California. I'm going to close that out. Here's the situation, Southern and Eastern, I should say, California. Here's the situation for Northern California. North Coast was actually near record flammability levels earlier in June during that unusually warm and dry period, but that has since dropped to now near average seasonal levels, so nothing to write home about there. Mendocino coast, interestingly, despite the fact that there have been relatively near to below average temperatures here, the flammability is higher than average for the time of year, getting close to typical seasonal maximums, which is unusual for June. I think that's because of the low precipitation in the spring, more so than warm temperatures recently on this particular part of the state. The Bay Marine environment, this is why I'm not particularly concerned about fire risk in the Bay Area right now, near or even slightly below average flammability levels for June, so that is not so concerning at all at low elevations. That's actually pretty tame. Santa Cruz Mountains, though, and here's the interesting thing. You go up in elevation above the lowest 1,500 feet, it's a very different story. This is still technically the Bay Area, but if we're talking about the mountains, the Diablo, the East Bay Hills, the Santa Cruz Mountains to the west, we've recently been near record flammability for the time of year. Again, not remarkable compared to peak seasonal levels. We've seen some values that are pretty close to what you would typically see in July or August in this region recently, and those have been record-breaking for the time of year. But again, with this cool trend, cool trough, whatever you want to call it, it will relax a little bit closer to average the next few days. It is worth noting there have been some small fires in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and even in Santa Cruz itself yesterday, there was, I believe, a small wildland fire in Natural Bridges Park, literally within almost a stone's throw of the Pacific Ocean yesterday, which caused a bit of a stir in Santa Cruz. And again, in the interior northwestern mountains, these would be like the Klamath Mountains, for example, notably elevated flammability because of that very warm interior and dry spring. So we are closer right now to levels of flammability we'd see in late July. So again, a month ahead of average. And in the northern Sacramento Valley and surrounding foothills, less exciting, that's good. Less excitement is good in this context. Slightly more flammable than usual, but that's not really something that I would point to as particularly notable. Northeastern California recently has been well above average. If you see this gap here of flammability near record for the time of year, but with this cool incoming trough, we're going to bring it back closer to average for the date. So this is the general, I don't want to belabor the point. Northern Sierra, again, more flammable than usual for the time of year, but not record-breaking. That's the general picture that we're seeing. As you go to higher elevations in more interior parts of California, and indeed in the Northern California average, conditions are currently more flammable, drier than usual, but not record-breaking for the time of year. Not too surprising. We'll see where these end up later, but that just sets the stage. Currently, drought-wise in the west, there is a lot of drought. This drought in the Pacific Northwest has worsened significantly this spring, and the Northern Rockies. Those are expected to get significantly worse this summer. This region will be a major focal point for wildfire activity. We're seeing a lot of fires right now in Utah. Well, there's severe drought that's widespread. We may start to see some fires in the western slope of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. New Mexico is going to get some drought relief in the next week as some tropical moisture from that rapidly intensifying, the record-breaking hurricane that just made landfall on the west coast of Mexico, the earliest and most intense hurricane to make landfall so early in the year along the west coast of Mexico in recorded history. That's going to send a nice plume of moisture and give some soaking rain to an area that needs it. Won't really help Arizona or points westward, though. This really is going to stay mostly east of the Arizona-New Mexico border, and the drought in this region is definitely expected to intensify this summer. In fact, there could be some intensification and addition of new drought and some of the gaps in the west where there isn't. This drought, of course, extends northward into Canada, where they're currently having a terrible wildfire season already. And so that does set the stage for what is to come. So what is to come? Well, this weekend, and by the way, I'll go and answer questions again toward the end of the session, so stay tuned. If you have some burning questions, I'll try and answer them. Here is where we are right now. I'm going to use the European model to toggle forward in time. What's plotted are the 500 millibar geopotential height anomaly map, meaning the departure from average of middle atmospheric pressures. You can think of it as in places that are red, the lower half of the atmosphere is warmer than average, and in places that are blue, the lower half of the atmosphere is cooler than average overall. So as you can see, we're going to have this trough and maybe a bit of a low embedded within the trough coming into California this weekend. This is overnight hours tonight into tomorrow, so Saturday. This trough axis, and when I say trough axis, I sort of mean essentially this. So you sort of draw it along the low point in the geopotential height field. So there is. So this is the trough, this U-shaped thing. This is a ridge to the east that goes like this if you were to extend the map. Hence, this is why it's called a trough. If this were topographic elevation, this would be the low point down here, and this would be the high point up here. They're not truly elevational, but they do sort of look like it, which is why they're visually resemble it anyway. As this trough moves through, it's mostly dry. There's a slight chance of a few showers up here and up here, but generally this is going to be a dry system as it moves through. It is going to help pick up that moisture over New Mexico, but that's all staying east of this line. This is why we're getting so much wind in Northern California and Nevada, the Great Basin, over the next couple of days. This is why there's red flag warnings in this region. This strong southwesterly flow. You're going to see smoke plumes that billow out of southwestern Utah and move in this direction over the next couple of days. So points eastward, getting a lot of smoke. Again, it is cool, and temperatures this weekend are, if I switch over to surface temperatures, they will indeed be quite chilly. In fact, that is a remarkably blue and purple map for what is effectively the summer solstice over the western U.S. These temperatures, some of the purples, if you look at the color scale, are on the order of minus 15 or 15 degrees centigrade below average. So you take 15 and multiply by 9/5, and you get Fahrenheit. These are far below average temperatures. Granted, they're not going to last very long, so it's just a day or two of extreme coolness, but there could actually be a handful of cool temperature records broken for the day anyway. Certainly not for the month of June or anything like that, but for the day in some locations, particularly in parts of the Great Basin. So that is notable. And this is Saturday, obviously. And then as you go into Sunday, you see this sort of shifting eastward. So it's still cooler than average, but it's already not as cool as it was on Saturday in relative terms in California. The maximum coolness factor, if you will, shifts into the northern Rockies. And then as we get into Monday, it continues to shift eastward. We're already seeing some near to slightly above average temperatures again in far northern California, so this coolness is going away. And then by as soon as Monday evening or Tuesday, we may actually see well above average temperatures return to much of the interior of northern California, especially the northern Sacramento Valley, the Pacific Northwest. Southern California is going to stay chillier longer, probably through Tuesday, and a good chunk of actually the rest of the West as well. But stepping forward in time, we get closer to the end of next week, getting into Thursday, we actually see potentially another heat wave. Whoops, that's not what I wanted to show here. I don't want a sounding. Nothing extreme, but definitely warmer than average temperatures. Snake River Plain, northern Sacramento Valley, southern San Joaquin Valley, replacing those cool temperatures as of late. And actually, I need to go back. Let me switch over to the ensemble now because we're getting more than a few days out. Go back to the most recent run. And then potentially what we see is, as we head toward the end of June, another modest heat wave across, again, this is pretty hot in the northern Sacramento Valley, the southern San Joaquin Valley, the Sierra Nevada once again. Not so hot along the coast. Remember how I said that familiar pattern was going to continue a bit? One place where it's not quite going to continue is coastal Southern California. Actually, it looks like it will be warmer than average as well as inland during this pattern. But generally speaking, a more widespread heat wave toward the end of the month, potentially across most of California, except for perhaps the immediate coast from the central coast northward to the Oregon border. And then that sort of continues. Again, this is a pretty widespread heat signal once again so the month will round out with much above average temperatures once again for most of the West. That kind of shifts inland as we go later into the month. Again, the coast not really getting into the action in California, but on average, if we sort of do some multi-day smoothing, on average, warmer temperatures than not across most of the West, except for the central and northern California coast once again. So another dipole between inland regions and the coast during this period. What is the consensus on what the actual height pattern will look like? Well, here's this weekend trough and low pressure system that moves eastward. It lingers a little bit. We get replaced with some ridging centered over the Pacific Northwest, as I mentioned, in late June. This will probably result in some magnitude of heat wave along the West Coast during this period. And as we get towards early July, there's more uncertainty. Notice that almost the entire map, I don't even need to draw it on the screen, the whole map is above average heights. So that means that in the entire domain, temperatures are warmer than average in the lower half of the atmosphere. Not extremely so, but diffusely so. Will this be centered more on the western ridge axis? That would mean some more heat for California. Or will this be centered more inland? That would mean more heat for the continental interior. That remains to be seen, not saying anything extreme at the moment. For perspective, though, I'm zooming out to the whole U.S. Look what's going to happen along the East Coast this weekend, though. Look at the magnitude of that extreme ridge along the East Coast of the U.S. This will probably be, in some locations, the most extreme June high-pressure system ever observed in this region, in the eastern U.S. So here we have a dipole. We have the low in California. We have the high to the east. And in this case, this will bring a really awful heat wave to the northeastern U.S., including Boston and New York and the mid-Atlantic, D.C., Virginia's. Temperatures reaching or even exceeding 100 degrees, and it will be a gross, disgusting, humid heat with heat indices as high as 110 degrees Fahrenheit along the highly populated I believe it's the I-95 corridor in the eastern U.S. So this will be a disgusting, horrible heat wave here. California lucking out in this relative period. But will this luck hold all summer? That's the big question mark, right? The short answer is I don't think so. I think we're likely to end up seeing big-time heat in California extending closer and closer to the coast as we go later in the season. Here is one of the reasons why I think that. If we look at the most recent super ensemble update from the European blend. European blend sounds like a wine or a coffee thing, but in fact it also applies to seasonal predictive ocean and coupled climate models. Let's see here. So here is the C3S. Let's zoom in on North America because that is, of course, the region of interest. Let us go instead to the ensemble mean anomaly. So this is the forward-looking prediction from this month, from June, the most recent update, as of last week, on temperatures month by month for the rest of the season from all of the global predictive models. So this is from all of the global predictive models from ECMWF, the Met Office, Météo France, the German Weather Agency, NCEP, which is the American, JMA, which is the Japanese agency, the Bureau of Meteorology, which is Australia. Anyway, it's all of the global contributions to seasonal prediction blended together. And what they tell us is that there is a huge orange and red blob across essentially all of North America beginning in July. But here's what's interesting. There is this wedge of near average temperatures over the northeastern Pacific during this period. So there's a little bit of weakness where the more extreme heat is likely to be more inland across, including, again, does this map look a little bit similar to what we've been seeing, where there's more extreme warmth in the interior of California and less so along the coast? That's a familiar pattern, suggesting that we might continue to see it to a certain extent into July, although this is really quite a strong signal for inland heat across California, the Pacific Northwest, the Rockies, southern and central Canada, eastern U.S. But as we toggle through the season, as we go from July to August, look at what starts to happen. Now, the relatively near average or cooler waters offshore start to sort of disappear, and this heat signal extends closer to the California coast and even offshore increasingly. And it continues to persist at a rather extreme level inland. Also, there's a big, nice warm blob over the northeastern Pacific. I step forward into September. Now this extends even closer. In fact, it encompasses all of the California coast and the offshore waters in well above average warmth, while the inland temperatures continue to be, over this region, just unrelentingly, highly anomalously warm. October further expands along the coast, and this really warm blob actually shifts back eastward across the central U.S., but again, the interior of California, the Southwest, the Rockies, all included, even as we go into autumn and beyond. So, one interesting thing here, I'm going to back up and look at ocean temperatures as well, briefly. Here's what we see with the ocean temperatures. If we look at North America, starting in July, let's go for the ensemble mean anomaly here. For July, the seasonal predictive model suggesting that water temperatures off the coast of Northern California, the Pacific Northwest, near average. So nothing to note, maybe a little bit warmer than average in Southern California. We have seen some of that recently, although, again, this is a forward-looking prediction for July. We're not in July yet. But the ocean temperature is not contributing a lot to anomalous warmth along the coast yet in July. But as we toggle forward in time, look at what happens. We go into August, we start to see warming now. We start to see warm water on most of the California coast. This is different than the prediction for April, May, or June, or even July. We go into September, late season. This is actually quite a strong warm signal off the immediate coast of California. This does include the California cold current region and the upwelling zone. So if this actually happens, this is one of the reasons why I expect this later this summer to be different than previous summers, and this dipole of really anomalous warmth inland and near to below average temperatures along the coast, I think will fade in the fall, persisting maybe even into the winter. So this is a different map, by the way, as we go toward November than we've seen recently, with pretty warm ocean all throughout the west coast. We've been seeing warm blobs in this part of the Pacific a lot in recent years, but there's been this cool arc in this region that there's a pretty strong consensus that is going away later this summer, which is why I think the picture looks different. Okay, time for me to answer some questions. So you're going to see my face come back full on the screen. Let's see here. I'm going to take a very quick 10-second water break, and then you may see an ad or something pop up on the screen while I do that, and then I'm going to start answering questions. So bear with me for just a moment here. Okay, folks, some of you may see an ad, but it'll catch up after the fact. I'm going to take a look at the questions now that have popped up. Very glad that the audio seems to be going well today. That's the good news of the day. Daphne remarks that I believe that the Western Marin County coolness is real. I definitely believe that it's been cooler than average. Whether it's been the coolest May on record in the last 130 years is the thing I'm a little wavering on. But stranger things have happened. Clearly, it would be quite an anomaly relative to anywhere else if that was the case. I do think part of those big dark blue blobs on these maps come from the lack of instrumentation in the region, and sometimes the fact that, for example, at the grid scale of these maps, Anomalous Bay is like blended with the land, so it might be conflating the ocean temperature with the air temperature in some cases. But in which case, yes, it would have been if the water temperature in Anomalous Bay was the air temperature, then that might well be the coolest May on record. All right, let's see here. I think I answered Brian's question surrounding whether the largely higher temperatures across inland areas and higher elevations have resulted in corresponding decreases in fuel moistures. The answer appears to generally be yes, with some exceptions. So I think we did cover that. Let's see here. There's a comment that anecdotally there is way less fuel this year in North Orange County. Thanks for referencing a specific location, by the way. That here can mean a lot of things depending on the audience. A way less fuel here this year in Northern Orange County. Weeds in 2023 were 8 feet tall. That is not surprising given the relationship we know between herbaceous vegetation, which is the predominant vegetation type in a lot of lower elevation coastal Southern California, and moisture levels. So essentially, following wet winters, you get a lot of extra growth of grass and brush. All else equal, it's not the only factor that matters, but if you have a similar amount of sunlight and all else is equal, you get a lot more grass and brush growth after the wet years. This was not a wet winter in Southern California. Most of Southern California saw only half the average amount of rainfall, and that is lucky that it got even that, because as of the end of January, it was near zero, so this mostly came in the late season. What this means is that on the heels of 2 really wet seasons in Southern California, we had a lot of growth of grass and brush following the 2023 and 2024 winters. But the 2025 winter, the way I've defined it, that's this year's, was really dry, and we would expect to see less new growth of grass and brush. It is true that in some regions there is still residual accumulation of grass, for example, from the previous 2 very wet seasons where fires did not occur and burn it away. So there is some residual grass and brush accumulation from previous years in some parts of the state, but in Southern California, this was a very dry, bad growing season for the native vegetation and the invasives as well, so you would expect there to be lower new fuel loading in those settings, and that's sort of consistent with that anecdote. It's a comment that given the sudden precipitation shut off earlier in the spring this year, that I'm worried wildfires are going to go back to crazy in July and August 2025, like they did in 2018 and 2020. That is largely consistent with my expectation as well. I expect to see a lack of remarkable fire activity the rest of the month for the most part. Maybe there could be some exceptions. And unless we get an extreme heat event in July, probably then too. But I really expect this to be a heavily back-weighted year, and it could be a pretty serious one, beginning later in July as we get into August, September, and depending on when the rains arrive, as we know in California, that can happen really late, well into October or even November in some cases, or beyond, as we saw this year in Southern California all the way through January. The comment from Mike Rose, given the recent strong onshore flow that has been a problem this May and June, are they adjusting the expectation of a heat dome, presumably later this season, as we have more upwelling due to the wind? So this is an interesting question. There is a question as to how much the nearshore waters, so the upwelling zone that I was talking about earlier by the Farallones and just a bit further offshore of Northern California, affect the large-scale atmosphere in the western U.S. It does exert some influence, but the main question of the magnitude of future ridging a couple months out is something that is largely controlled by other factors elsewhere in the global atmosphere and ocean system. So my guess is it probably doesn't factor into the large-scale pattern. It definitely affects how cool it is in San Francisco, of course. I'm not sure how much feedback there is to the large-scale pattern. The other thing, too, is that these coarse seasonal models still probably aren't really fine enough in scale to fully represent that California cold current and the fine scale variations in those mesoscale ocean eddies that are really important for some of these processes. So is it a missing process in the modeling chain of events? Add it to the list in a certain sense. So that, it's possible. But I think that it's probably not likely to be a particularly dominant factor for the large scale pattern later. But I've been surprised before. That's a good question. The next one is there information about the next autumn regarding precipitation, heat, and offshore wind events? Is California likely to experience a massive delay in autumn precip, or are rains likely to arrive earlier? So the answer is different for each individual physical variable mentioned, so I'll go through them in order. I'll start with heat because it's the easiest one. The answer is yes. There is a strong expectation that this autumn will be much warmer than average virtually everywhere in California. That alone would probably tend to suggest that we see a late shift in fire season, a later and more severe peak in fire season, and drier vegetation at the peak in fall and later in the year. So all else equal, that strong expectation of a hot autumn, including closer to the coast, would point in that direction. And it's the one variable that we actually have a decent chance at predicting several months out. Regarding precipitation, we really don't have very good seasonal predictability of precipitation in California. That's just the reality, unless there is a strong El Nino or strong La Nina event, and if it is the middle of winter. Well, the fall is not winter, and we do not have either presently or expect to have a strong El Nino or La Nina event to give us much predictability about the fall precipitation. So the answer is, I don't know. No one can really tell us. Same goes for autumn offshore winds, because the offshore rain, the offshore winds, the inside slider type systems versus wet precipitation producing outside slider storms in the fall are kind of two sides of the same coin. So not a lot of predictability this far out, kind of agnostic. So my assumption would be, in the absence of a strong prediction for those kinds of things, that they have roughly the average likelihood of occurring that they would in fall historically, but with the expectation that it'll be much warmer than average in that context. But we do know that there's a trend toward drier autumns and a delayed onset of the rainy season in California in general over the past 40 or 50 years. This has been a sustained trend. Is this due to climate change or other factors? Remains a fairly active topic of conversation. There is certainly evidence that it has happened, so that's important. And there is some evidence in climate models that fall probably will, on average, become a period of decreased precipitation or with a later onset of the rainy season. That's a little bit more uncertain, but it is what a majority of climate models suggest. We certainly see it in the data historically. So, generally speaking, this is not so much a statement about this year, but about this decade, for example, relative to 50 years ago. We know that autumns are much warmer than they used to be for sure, and this autumn looks like it's going to be an exceptionally warm autumn, even in the recent context. We know that there's been a trend towards delayed onset of the autumn rainy season in California and less autumn precipitation overall. And there is a weak expectation that that trend is probably being caused by climate change, more likely than not. I wouldn't say it's something we have, as a scientist, 95th percentile confidence in, but maybe 80th percentile confidence, which might sound like a lot, but in science that's considered not enough to make a definitive statement about most things. I think for conversations like this one, if we have 80th percentile confidence is actually good enough to start talking about it, I should hope. So I think statistically there is a slightly increased odds that the autumn in general will be dry, that the rainy season will arrive a month or two later, combined with the fact that that long-term trend, plus we know that this fall is likely to be warmer even than the recent warming trend, that does suggest that autumn could be a rough fire period for California and the West in general. That's sort of my thinking about that. There's a question from Loretta. Any prediction for the July 4th when the fools light up the dry tinder? And I'll probably have a future session closer to then, and I'll talk about this, but if you look at a plot of the number of human-caused wildland fire ignitions in the western United States as a function of the day of the year, the plot kind of looks like this. It's kind of noisy, and then on the 4th of July, it goes off the charts up and stays there for a couple of days while people use their fireworks, and for a couple of days later when they expend their fireworks that they didn't use on the 4th, and then it goes right back down to baseline. It's frustrating. It's probably not that surprising. It could be a big problem this year because there's a wide swath of the West where fireworks are common and in some cases legal, although in many cases not, where having a bunch of human-caused ignitions is not really what we need to see. So, if it were up to me, you wouldn't be able to light off fireworks in flammable areas anywhere in the West, but even though that's a law on the books in many places, people do it anyway, and so the next best thing is for people to be as careful as they can be and to be prepared for the vegetation in virtually every direction surrounding you to be quite flammable. That's a pretty safe assumption, and under such an assumption, I personally would not light off any fireworks, but I realize that's not necessarily a decision that everyone's going to make, so hopefully people make the best possible decision in whatever context they're in. That's all I gotta say. But there are always a lot of fire ignitions around the 4th, specifically due to fireworks. It is just an annual tradition in the American West, unfortunately. Sam asks for a quick update on NOAA about funding. I don't really have any new information surrounding NOAA. It continues to look very ominous as to what is coming. I don't really have any updates from the last time. There were a couple of really good articles that just came out regarding the not just NOAA but also the Forest Service, Department of Interior, and other agencies and FEMA agencies that either prepare for or respond to disasters, including wildfire, but also other ones. One of these is by Haley Smith, LA Times. I spoke with her like last week or the week before. There's another one out in The Guardian where they actually interviewed a bunch of wildland firefighters for the Inside Scoop. They had to do it anonymously because everyone is afraid for their jobs. The almost universal picture, except from agency spokespersons, is that everything is in alarming disarray, and that there is likely to be a greatly reduced capacity to respond to all disasters, and in particular wild and fire-related ones this season, which is a particularly concerning alignment given the prediction for, in general, a very active season across most of the West, as I've talked about before. So that is a significant concern. There's a comment about weather apps and their reliability or lack thereof. Question for another day, but check out any of my numerous Slate TBD podcast interviews or Adam Conover's Factually podcast, where I talk at length about what I really feel about those weather apps, or as perhaps they are better termed, the crap apps. That's a common term of art in the meteorological world, let's just say. Thank you, Mike, for the kind words and the kind words of others as well. All right, well, I think that just about covers things. Glad some of the tech issues seem to be, like, for today at least, knock on wood, I can say it now that I'm done with the session, seem to be resolved. So thank you for joining. As always, I did write up a blog post yesterday at weatherwest.com talking about much of what I talked about today, but with more details and more graphics if you want to go check it out. Also, if you go to weatherwest.com, I also included a link to a short monologue that I recorded to a University of Southern California, USC, conference on dams in the American West and their complicated future in a warming world, sort of how they have provided a lot of benefits for people who live in the West and also have caused some problems, and how that tension is likely to continue. There's a link to that video on weatherwest.com embedded in my most recent blog post. Again, this was recorded for an event at USC back in May, but I just made it available yesterday for everyone to view. It's only 8 minutes long, so if you're interested, it's not a tremendous time commitment. All right, well, again, thanks for joining. Hopefully not too much fire activity this weekend in California. I do think the risk is probably higher over the Great Basin, but there will be some potentially wind-driven grass fires in California over the next couple of days. We'll see how July goes, and I'll talk to you next week. Thanks, everyone.